Chapter 1. The history that didn't happen. There is a version of the 20th century that never existed. In that version, Adolf Hitler dies in 1939. Or 1943. Or the 20th of July, 1944. The war ends years earlier. The Holocaust, still underway in that last year, is cut short. The cities of Europe are not reduced to rubble. The Soviet Union does not occupy half a continent. The atomic bomb is never used in anger because the war ends before it is ready. In that version of history, somewhere between 40 and 80 million people do not die. That version existed, repeatedly, as a live possibility. Adolf Hitler survived at least 42 documented assassination attempts, possibly more, depending on how you define the word attempt. He survived bombs, bullets, poison plots, strangling attempts, and at least one plan to push him from a moving aircraft. He survived, in 1944, a bomb placed directly under his conference table that killed 4 of the men standing beside him. How? Some of the answer is luck. Some is the paranoid security apparatus of the Nazi state. Some is the simple statistical reality that 42 attempts by amateurs, semi-amateurs, and men operating under near-impossible conditions will mostly fail. But some of the answer is stranger and more disturbing than any of those explanations. Some of the answer is that Allied intelligence, the most sophisticated espionage apparatus in the world by 1943, inadvertently, systemically, and in ways it could not fully understand at the time, protected Adolf Hitler from the people who most wanted to kill him. Not deliberately. Not maliciously. Not because anyone in MI6 or the OSS or the so wanted Hitler alive. But because the logic of intelligence work, the cold, operational logic of deception and compartmentalization and calculated silence, sometimes served the Führer better than it served the men trying to bring him down. This is that story. It runs through the living rooms of Swiss bankers and the torture chambers of the Gestapo. Through the drawing rooms of British aristocrats who thought Hitler a reasonable man and the basement offices of Whitehall where other men worked day and night to convince the Germans of things that were not true. Through the tragic figure of men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, who carried a bomb in his briefcase and came within inches of changing everything, and failed, in part, because the network that might have supported him had been compromised by the very intelligence war his would-be allies were winning everywhere else. By the end of this story, you will understand why the most sophisticated intelligence operation in the history of warfare, the British double-cross system, was simultaneously the greatest intelligence triumph of the war and a mechanism that, in ways its architects never intended, helped keep one of history's greatest monsters alive. Welcome to the Intelligence War. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Deception. How Britain owned German intelligence. To understand the paradox at the heart of this story, you have to understand what Britain had done to German intelligence by 1941. It had destroyed it. Completely. Invisibly. So thoroughly that the Germans never knew it had happened. When Germany went to war in 1939, the Abwehr, military intelligence, run by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, had ambitious plans to embed a network of spies across Britain. Agents would report on troop movements, industrial production, civilian morale. They would identify bombing targets, feed false intelligence to confuse British planners, and, in the event of an invasion, guide German forces to their objectives. By 1941, every single German agent in Britain was either in prison, dead, or working for the British. This was not an accident. It was the product of a systematic, extraordinarily patient counterintelligence operation run by MI5, the security service, in coordination with a group called the 20 Committee, named with characteristic English understatement for the Roman numerals XX. The double cross. The mechanics were elegant. When a German agent arrived in Britain, by parachute, by boat, by commercial travel before the war closed those routes, MI5 was usually waiting. British intelligence had broken the German Enigma cipher system at Bletchley Park, which meant they could read the instructions sent to each agent before he arrived. They knew the agent's cover name, his mission, his contacts, his communications frequencies. When he landed, the choice was simple. Work for us, or hang. Most chose to work for the British. What followed was something unprecedented in the history of espionage. The turned agents were allowed to continue transmitting to their German handlers, but now every message was controlled by the 20 Committee. The Germans, believing they had a functioning spy network inside Britain, were receiving a carefully constructed fiction. Order of battle information that was accurate enough to be credible but wrong in the details that mattered. Troop deployments that were real units in fictional locations. Morale reports that fed German assumptions back to them in subtly distorted form. The genius of the system was that it didn't just deny the Germans accurate intelligence. It actively poisoned their ability to evaluate any intelligence at all. Because their agents were reporting regularly and consistently and with enough verifiable detail to seem reliable, the Abwehr had no reason to suspect that the entire network was fabricated. When a double-cross agent reported that a particular airfield was at a particular location, the Germans checked it against aerial reconnaissance and found it was correct. This established credibility. When the same agent then reported that the main Allied invasion force was assembling in Kent rather than Hampshire, the Germans believed it. By 1943, Britain was not just reading German intelligence traffic. It was writing it. And this extraordinary power had a side effect that nobody in the 20 Committee ever fully calculated. It meant that any German resistance figure who tried to use British intelligence contacts to coordinate an assassination of Hitler was operating in a landscape that Britain controlled. The people he might reach out to, the neutral country intermediaries, the businessmen with contacts on both sides, the diplomats with back-channel relationships, were, many of them, already inside the double-cross system, already feeding information back to Whitehall, already subject to the cold operational logic that said, "Our deception operations matter more than any individual outcome, including this one." Chapter 3. Canaris. The spy master who hated his master. At the center of the German intelligence apparatus, and, in ways that would take decades to fully understand, at the center of the Allied deception operation as well, sat one of the most enigmatic figures of the entire war. Admiral Wilhelm Franz Canaris. Head of the Abwehr. Servant of the Reich. And, almost certainly, one of the most consequential double agents in the history of modern espionage. Canaris was 60 years old in 1945. He was small, white-haired, soft-spoken, with an air of perpetual mild distraction that concealed one of the most acute intelligence minds of the century. He had served in the Imperial Navy in the First World War, been captured by the British, escaped, and returned to Germany via Spain, an experience that gave him a permanent love of the Iberian Peninsula and a permanent fascination with the ambiguities of intelligence work. He rose through the naval ranks and into intelligence, and by 1935 he was running the Abwehr. What nobody outside a small circle knew, what the Gestapo suspected but could never quite prove, was that Canaris had turned against Hitler. Not dramatically, not through a sudden conversion, but through a slow accumulation of horrors. He had seen the SS mobile killing squads operating in Poland in 1939. He had read the reports from the Eastern Front. He had watched, with growing dread, as the regime he served committed atrocities that put it beyond the pale of any civilized understanding of war. Canaris began, carefully and with the particular caution of a man who understood exactly what discovery would cost him, to sabotage the Reich's intelligence operations. He recruited officers who shared his doubts, among them his deputy Hans Oster, and the military lawyer Hans von Donani, who would become central figures in the German resistance. He allowed operations to fail in ways that looked like incompetence. He funneled money and false papers to Jews and political refugees to help them escape. He maintained back-channel communications with Allied intelligence services through Spanish intermediaries. Most critically for our story, Canaris knew about multiple plots to kill Hitler. He knew about them because many of the plotters worked for him or were connected to men who did. And he did not report them to the Gestapo. The British, through ultra-intercepts and their Spanish intelligence network, knew something of Canaris. They knew he was not a straightforward servant of the Nazi state. They had, through intermediaries, communicated with his circle. And they had made a calculation, the same cold calculation that runs through every decision in this story, that Canaris alive and running a compromised Abwehr was more valuable to British intelligence than Canaris dead and replaced by a true believer. So when Canaris's position became increasingly precarious, as the Gestapo closed in, as the evidence mounted, as the SS under Himmler worked to destroy the Abwehr and absorb its functions, the British watched and did not intervene. They did not warn him. They did not attempt to extract him. They let the operation run. In February 1944, Hitler dissolved the Abwehr. Canaris was placed under house arrest. After the July 20 bomb plot, when investigators found documents in Zossen that implicated his entire network, he was arrested, tortured, and on April 9, 1945, less than 4 weeks before Germany surrendered, he was hanged at Flossenbürg concentration camp. He died 3 weeks before the war ended. The men who might have warned him had been running him as an asset too carefully to risk exposing their knowledge of his situation. This is what the intelligence war looks like from the inside. Not heroic. Not clean. A series of calculated silences, each one of which has a body count attached to it. Chapter 4. The Assassination Plots. A taxonomy of failure. There were 42 of them. 42 documented attempts to kill Adolf Hitler, spread across the 12 years of the Third Reich. Some were serious, carefully planned operations mounted by trained soldiers with access to Hitler's inner circle. Some were lone wolf attempts by ordinary Germans, Poles, Swiss nationals, and stateless refugees who saw in Hitler the source of a catastrophe and decided, individually and without coordination, to try to stop it. Some were bizarre, almost farcical in their conception, evidence less of strategic thinking than of raw, desperate human fury. To understand why Allied intelligence mattered to so many of them, you need to understand what they had in common. Almost all of the serious plots required, at some point, either communication with the Allies, or reliance on a resistance network that the Allies had penetrated, or access to material or explosives, timing devices, communications equipment, that could only come from outside Germany. Let's begin at the beginning. Or rather, let's begin in 1938, which is where the story of organized resistance to Hitler properly starts, even though Hitler had been in power for 5 years already. In 1938, a group of senior German military officers came closer to removing Hitler than any group before or since, not through assassination, but through arrest. The plan, developed by General Ludwig Beck and the then head of military counterintelligence Hans Oster, was elegant in its simplicity. When Hitler gave the order to invade Czechoslovakia, an order that Beck was certain would trigger a general European war that Germany would lose, the conspirators would arrest him, declare him mentally unfit, and end the Nazi government before the catastrophe it was about to cause became irreversible. The plan was operationally sound. The conspirators had troops. They had legal cover, the German constitution provided mechanisms for declaring a leader incapacitated. They had enough support in the Army High Command to make the operation credible. What they didn't have was a crisis. Because at precisely the moment when Hitler's recklessness should have produced the confrontation that would have triggered the coup, the British and French governments, represented by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, flew to Munich and gave Hitler everything he wanted. The Sudetenland. Without a war. Without resistance. Without the catastrophe that the conspirators had been counting on to justify their action. In one of history's most bitter ironies, the policy of appeasement that was meant to prevent war also prevented the coup that might have prevented the war. The conspirators stood down. The moment passed. And Hitler, emboldened beyond all previous measure by the capitulation at Munich, concluded that his instincts were infallible and his opponents cowards. The 1938 plot failed because of British foreign policy. Not British intelligence, British foreign policy. But it established the template that would repeat itself, with variations, for the next 6 years. Organized German resistance to Hitler was structurally dependent on Allied decisions, Allied actions, Allied assessments that prioritized other objectives over the removal of the man at the center of everything. Move forward to 1943. The war has turned. Stalingrad has fallen. The German army has suffered catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. A group of officers around Colonel Henning von Tresckow, serving in Army Group Center, have concluded that Hitler must die and are preparing to act. On March 13, 1943, von Tresckow placed a package on board Hitler's personal aircraft as it left Smolensk. The package contained 2 British-made plastic explosive charges, clam charges of the type produced by SO, the Special Operations Executive, connected to a modified British fuse. It was disguised as a bottle of brandy, ostensibly a gift for a colleague in Berlin. The bomb did not detonate. The fuse, apparently affected by the extreme cold in the aircraft's unheated cargo hold, failed to fire. Hitler landed safely in Berlin. Von Tresckow, realizing the package had not done its work, managed to retrieve it before it was examined, claiming there had been a mix-up with the parcel. Notice the material. British plastic explosive. British fuse. These had reached the conspirators through the resistance supply chain, through contacts in neutral countries, through the complex web of clandestine logistics that SO was running across occupied Europe. Now here is the thing nobody in SO knew at the time, and that historians are still piecing together from archives that took 50 years to declassify. Some of those supply chains were compromised. Some of the couriers carrying materials into Germany were known to German counterintelligence. The Gestapo was watching certain routes, certain people, certain meetings. Not because they had broken SO's codes, though they had, in some cases, but because the German resistance itself had been penetrated, at multiple levels, by informers. Who were those informers? Some were genuine Gestapo agents. Some were resistance members who had broken under torture. And some were people whose names appeared in Allied intelligence files as contacts and intermediaries, people whose reports were traveling back to London through channels that seemed secure but weren't. People who existed in that grey space between the resistance and the intelligence services, serving multiple masters simultaneously, as people in that space always do. The bomb failed. The fuse was cold. That much is simple physics. But the reason von Tresckow was working with a modified British fuse in the first place, rather than German military material that he could have accessed directly, tells you something about the dependency chains that made the resistance structurally vulnerable to Allied intelligence failures. Chapter 5. The double-cross system and the German resistance. The British double-cross system was designed to do one thing: win the intelligence war against Germany. It was not designed to support the German resistance. It was not designed to facilitate assassination plots. And when those two objectives collided, as they did, repeatedly, throughout the war, the double-cross system won. Every time. To understand why, you have to understand the logic that governed it. The 20 Committee, which oversaw the double-cross system, operated on a principle that sounds almost mathematical. The value of a deception operation is proportional to its consistency. An agent who is believed because he has been reliable for 2 years can deliver a decisive deception, can make the Germans send their panzers to the wrong beach on D-Day, for instance, because his track record has earned him credibility. The moment you use that agent for something that might blow his cover, you lose not just him but every operational dividend he has produced and could produce. This meant that whenever a double-cross agent, or a network adjacent to the double-cross system, was contacted by someone in the German resistance looking for British support, the 20 Committee faced a choice. They could respond, risk exposure, potentially blow agents whose value was incalculable. Or they could stay silent, maintain the integrity of the deception, and let the resistance work without British support. They almost always stayed silent. The consequences were not abstract. In 1943 and early 1944, multiple emissaries from the German resistance made contact with British intelligence through neutral country intermediaries. Adam von Trutzow-Sols, a German diplomat and resistance member, made contact through Switzerland. Ulrich von Hassel, a former German ambassador, used his neutral country contacts. Karl Gordeler, the former mayor of Leipzig who was the intended civilian head of the post-Hitler government, had been communicating with British contacts since before the war. These men were offering something extraordinary. Inside intelligence on German military planning, the assurance of a negotiated peace if Hitler was removed, and the cooperation of a resistance network that reached into the highest levels of the Wehrmacht. The British response was, at best, cautious. At worst, it was silence. Why? Partly because the British, with good reason, given their experience, did not fully trust the resistance. The German resistance had been penetrated before. Gestapo agents had posed as resistance members and fed false information to Allied contacts. The British were right to be skeptical. But the deeper reason was the double-cross system itself. The British could not respond warmly to German resistance overtures without risking the one thing they valued above everything else: the integrity of their deception operations. If a double-cross agent or a contact within the double-cross network was seen to be passing messages to and from the German resistance, and the Germans found out, the entire edifice collapsed. The deceptions that were being built for D-Day, the operations that would save tens of thousands of Allied lives by directing German forces to the wrong beaches, were too important to risk. So the resistance was left out in the cold. Not betrayed, never actively betrayed. But not supported either. Left to operate without the communications infrastructure, without the material support, without the political backing that might have made the difference. There is a document, still partially classified, that surfaces in the historiography of this period. A 20-committee assessment from late 1943, discussing a request from a resistance intermediary for a signal that the British would negotiate with a post-Hitler government. The assessment concludes that sending such a signal would be premature, that the resistance had not demonstrated the capability to act, and that in any case the unconditional surrender policy agreed with the Americans and Soviets at Casablanca precluded any negotiated settlement. The unconditional surrender policy. This is perhaps the most consequential decision in the entire story, and it was made not by intelligence officers but by heads of state. At Casablanca in January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill announced that the Allies would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender from Germany. No negotiations. No deals. No separate peace. The policy was designed to reassure the Soviets that the Western Allies would not make a separate deal that left Russia fighting alone. It succeeded in that purpose. But it also, in one stroke, removed the primary incentive structure that made the German resistance worth risking. What were the plotters offering, ultimately? A negotiated end to the war. A Germany that would stop fighting in exchange for a government that the Allies could do business with. If unconditional surrender was the only acceptable outcome, then a coup that produced a negotiated peace was not an Allied objective, it was an Allied problem. The resistance knew this. Von Trapp zu Sol said explicitly, in one of his communications with British contacts, that the unconditional surrender policy was the single greatest obstacle to the success of the German resistance. It removed the argument that a coup was in Germany's rational self-interest. It made it harder for resistance members to recruit wavering officers who might have joined if there was a prospect of a negotiated outcome. And it gave the Gestapo a propaganda tool. Resistance to Hitler, they could argue, was futile because the Allies would destroy Germany regardless. All of this was true. And none of it was changed. Chapter 6. The Bodyguard of Lies. Operation Fortitude and the Protection of Hitler. Winston Churchill said it. Truth, in wartime, is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. He meant it as a justification for deception operations. It became, inadvertently, an epitaph for the men of the German resistance. The greatest Allied deception operation of the war was Operation Bodyguard, and within it, the crown jewel, Operation Fortitude. The goal? Convince the Germans that the D-Day landings in Normandy were a feint, that the real invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais, and that a massive Allied force called Führer, the first United States Army group, was waiting in England to deliver the killing blow. Führer did not exist. It was a fiction, a radio traffic phantom, a collection of fake headquarters and simulated Army group communications, commanded, for credibility, by the most famous American general in Europe. George S. Patton. The deception required the double-cross agents to be operating at full capacity, feeding the Germans a continuous stream of false intelligence about Allied order of battle, troop locations, and operational intentions. Every one of those agents had to be believed. Every piece of false intelligence they transmitted had to be consistent with every other piece. The system was a machine of extraordinary delicacy. One wrong note and it fell apart. Now consider what was happening in Germany in the same period. The conspirators around Stauffenberg, by early 1944 the operational center of gravity of the assassination plots, were making their preparations for Operation Valkyrie. They had a plan. They had a bomb. They had, in Stauffenberg himself, a man of exceptional courage who was willing to carry the device into Hitler's presence and detonate it. What they needed was what they had always needed. Some signal from the Allies that their action would be recognized, that a post-Hitler government would have a basis on which to negotiate, that the sacrifice being contemplated would not simply result in unconditional German surrender with different faces at the signing table. And they needed, more practically, the kind of intelligent support that would allow them to survive long enough to form that government. They needed to know which Allied operations were coming, and when, so that they could time the coup to coincide with a moment of maximum German military pressure, a moment when wavering officers would see the coup as the only rational option. They needed to know where the Allies would land in France, because the location and timing of the invasion would determine the military situation that Valkyrie had to exploit. What they got was silence. The Allies could not tell the conspirators where the invasion was coming because that information was the most closely guarded secret of the war and because the double-cross system, which was managing the deception, could not risk any communication channel that might leak it. The conspirators were not trusted, not because they were untrustworthy, but because no communication channel in the compromised landscape of 194,344 Germany could be trusted. And so the conspirators planned Valkyrie without knowing that the Allies were coming to Normandy on June 6. Without knowing that the deception operation would pin 40 German divisions at Pas-de-Calais for weeks after the landings, waiting for the phantom fusag. Without knowing that the military situation on the Western Front after D-Day would evolve in ways that, had they known, might have changed their timing, their approach, perhaps the outcome. The bodyguard of lies that protected the D-Day landings also blinded the men who came closest to killing Hitler. There is a specific mechanism here worth examining in detail, because it illustrates the problem with painful precision. One of the double-cross agents, a man known to historians as Garbo, a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Gaca who had talked his way into the German intelligence service and then immediately offered his services to the British, was, by 1944, the most trusted agent in the entire German intelligence network. His fictional sub-agents, his elaborate reports, his painstaking construction of a false intelligence picture had made him indispensable to the Abwehr. Garbo's crowning achievement was a message he sent on the night of June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day, warning the Germans that the invasion was imminent. The message arrived too late to be acted on. But it cemented his credibility so thoroughly that when, on June 9, he transmitted another report saying that the Normandy landings were a diversion and the real invasion was at Pas-de-Calais, Hitler personally ordered 2 panzer divisions to hold back from Normandy and wait for the blow that never came. Garbo's message kept those divisions away from the beaches. It was one of the most consequential acts of individual deception in the history of warfare. But Garbo was also, by nature of his position, connected to a network of contacts in neutral countries and within Germany itself. Those contact points, the same architecture of trust that made him valuable, were points of intersection with the German resistance. The 20 committees' management of Garbo meant that every communication through those channels was controlled, monitored, and evaluated for its impact on the deception. Any message from the resistance that arrived through those channels was processed through the same filter. The resistance existed in the shadow of the deception. Protected by it in some ways, the German counterintelligence services that might have rolled it up more efficiently were being fed false information about Allied networks. But blinded by it too. Cut off from the operational intelligence that might have given them the one thing they needed most. The right moment. Chapter 7. The Gestapo and the penetration problem. There is a word that runs through every intelligence history of this period like a fault line through bedrock. Penetration. To penetrate a network is to place an agent inside it, someone who belongs, who is trusted, who passes information outward to a service the network doesn't know is listening. Every intelligence service in the Second World War was obsessed with penetration, both achieving it against the enemy and preventing it from happening to themselves. The Gestapo was extraordinarily good at penetration. Not because its agents were universally brilliant, many were not, but because it had two structural advantages that no other service possessed. The first was terror. The Gestapo could do things that no democratic intelligence service could do. It could arrest a resistance contact, subject him to torture that the 20th century had industrialized to an unprecedented degree, and extract from him names, addresses, communication protocols, and operational details that would unravel an entire network. The resistance knew this. Every member of the German resistance operated under the knowledge that capture meant not just death but the probable destruction of everyone they had ever worked with. This fear was not paranoia. It was an accurate assessment. The Gestapo had rolled up the Red Orchestra, the Soviet intelligence network operating inside Germany, through exactly this method. Arrest one agent, torture him, get the next name, arrest that person, torture them. A chain of broken people leading from the periphery to the center. The Red Orchestra was destroyed between 1941 and 1943. By the time it was finished, over 100 people were dead. The German resistance, the military resistance around Beck, Oster, and eventually Stauffenberg, was different in structure from the Red Orchestra. It was not a hierarchical network in the same way. It was a loose coalition of people who knew each other through pre-war professional and social connections, through the shared experience of military service, through family ties and university friendships. This made it harder to roll up through a chain of arrests. But it also meant it had no formal communication security. People talked to each other in person, over dinner, in the offices of the War Ministry, in ways that left no written record but created enormous operational exposure. The second Gestapo advantage was informers. The Nazi state had created, through a combination of ideology, fear, and material incentive, a population that informed on itself at a scale no previous government had achieved. It is estimated that the Gestapo had one informer for every 2,000 Germans in 1939, and that the ratio improved, from the Gestapo's perspective, as the war went on and the penalties for disloyalty became clearer. Within the military and intelligence services, this penetration was systematic. The SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS Intelligence Service, had assets inside the Wehrmacht, inside the Foreign Ministry, and inside the Abwehr. These assets were not always identified as such. Many were passive informers, people who reported conversations and suspicions without being formally recruited. But they were there, and they were listening. Now add the Allied dimension. The British, through Ultra, could read German communications traffic at the highest levels. They knew, in real time, about Gestapo investigations, about SD surveillance operations, about arrests and interrogations. They knew when resistance members were under suspicion. They knew, sometimes, before those members knew themselves, that their networks had been compromised. And they did not tell them. Could they have? In some cases, almost certainly. The Germans did not know that their Enigma encrypted communications were being read. A warning to a resistance member, delivered through a sufficiently indirect channel, would not necessarily have revealed the ultra-secret. The 20 Committee had managed far more delicate information exchanges without compromising Ultra. But the 20 Committee's mandate was not to protect the German resistance. Its mandate was to maintain the double-cross system and support Allied military operations. Warnings to resistance members were not in that mandate. They fell, institutionally, between the cracks of the Allied intelligence structure, between MI5 and MI6, between the intelligence services and the SO, between the British and the Americans who were being kept at arm's length from Ultra for the first years of the war. There were individuals who understood the situation and were troubled by it. Some officers at Bletchley Park are recorded, in private correspondence, as having been disturbed by the contrast between what they were reading in the German traffic and what was being done with that information. But the institutional logic was overwhelming. Ultra was the war-winning secret. Nothing compromised Ultra. Not even the lives of the men trying to kill Hitler. The result was a kind of terrible asymmetry. The Gestapo, operating in ignorance, had one advantage. It could act on what it suspected. The British, operating with almost complete knowledge, had one constraint. They could not act on what they knew without revealing how they knew it. In the specific domain of protecting the resistance, the Gestapo's ignorant aggression was more effective than British omniscient paralysis.